The strangest part about being fired is not hearing the words. It is watching the people who need you most say them with complete confidence. That was exactly what happened to me on a Tuesday morning in Detroit. At 9:17 a.m., I was standing inside a glass conference room with 3 executives staring at me from across a polished table. On the screen behind them was a number none of them wanted to see. 87,000. That was how much the company was losing because of a crisis I had been warning them about for nearly 6 weeks. And somehow, I was the one being blamed. My name is Daniel Carter, and at the time, I had worked for Northstar Industrial Solutions for almost 11 years. I wasn't the CEO. I wasn't even a vice president. I was the operations systems manager. But I knew the company's internal systems better than almost anyone. If a shipment disappeared from the system, I knew where to look. If a supplier suddenly stopped receiving purchase orders, I knew which connection had failed. If the warehouse numbers didn't match the accounting records, I could usually find the problem before lunch. For years, people joked that I was the man they called when nobody else knew what was happening. I used to laugh at that. That morning, nobody was laughing. My boss, Richard Hale, sat at the head of the table. He had been promoted to regional director only 8 months earlier. Beside him sat the finance manager, Karen Brooks. And at the other end was the company's new consultant, Mark Voss. Mark had been with us for only 4 months. He wore expensive suits, spoke confidently, and had somehow convinced senior management that every problem at Northstar could be solved by cutting costs. That morning, he had one more suggestion: cut me. Richard folded his hands. Daniel, we've made a decision. I already knew where this was going. Still, I asked, what kind of decision? He looked uncomfortable for half a second. Then his expression changed. We're eliminating your position. I stared at him. Outside the conference room, employees were walking between departments, completely unaware of what was happening. I looked at the screen. The 87,000 loss was still there. Then I looked back at Richard. You're eliminating the person currently trying to stop that loss. Karen looked down. Mark leaned back. Richard cleared his throat. We need to reduce operating expenses. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I asked one question. Who is going to handle the system failure? Richard answered immediately. Mark's team will oversee it. I turned toward Mark. He smiled. Don't worry, Daniel. We've got it. That sentence would become important later. Very important. I nodded slowly. Okay. Richard seemed surprised by how calm I was. You understand. I understand. He pushed a folder across the table. Inside were my termination documents. 11 years of loyalty reduced to several pages and a signature line. I picked up the folder. Then I stood. Before leaving, I looked at the screen one last time. 87,000, I said quietly. Richard nodded. I looked directly at him. You're going to remember that number. Then I walked out. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't threaten anyone. And I didn't tell them the one thing I knew that they didn't. Because 6 weeks earlier, I had discovered exactly what was causing the crisis. And I had documented everything. Every failed transaction. Every warning. Every email. Every meeting. Every time I told Richard that the company's new software system was being connected incorrectly. I had copies of all of it, and now that they had fired me, I no longer had any reason to protect them from their own decisions. The crisis had started quietly. In early February, Northstar had switched to a new inventory and ordering system. The executives loved the presentation. The consultant promised the transition would reduce operating costs by nearly $400,000 a year. Everyone applauded. I didn't. Not because I hated the new system. I actually liked parts of it. The problem was the way Mark's team had connected it to our older warehouse software. 2 systems were exchanging information incorrectly. Orders were being duplicated. Some purchase orders were being delayed. And in a few cases, inventory counts were being updated hours after the physical movement of products. That might sound like a small technical problem. It wasn't. North Star supplied industrial components to manufacturers across several states. When the system said a product was available, customers expected it to be available. When the system said a shipment had left the warehouse, accounting expected it to be moving. But the numbers weren't matching. I noticed the pattern almost immediately, so I documented it. Then I emailed Richard. I wrote, "We have a synchronization issue between the new ordering platform and the warehouse database. If we don't correct the mapping, the financial exposure could exceed 50,000 within the next month." Richard replied the next morning, "Thanks, Daniel. Mark is handling the transition." I sent another message. Then another. 2 weeks later, the exposure had climbed. 61,000, then 73,000, then 87,000, and every time I raised the issue, I heard the same response: "Mark has it under control." Eventually, Mark called me into his office. He closed the door. "Daniel, you're making this bigger than it is." I looked at him. "Then show me where I'm wrong." He smiled. "You've been here too long." I didn't understand what he meant. Then he continued, "Sometimes people who have been in one company for a long time become attached to the old way of doing things. This isn't about old systems," I said. "It's about bad data." He leaned forward. "Management wants results. So do I. Then stop sending emails that make the project look bad." That sentence stayed with me. Because he wasn't asking me to fix the problem, he was asking me to stop documenting it. I refused. 3 days later, my access to one of the reporting dashboards disappeared. I asked why. No answer. A week later, I was excluded from a meeting about the exact system I had been warning everyone about. Then came the conference room. Then the folder. Then the words, "Your position is being eliminated." At the time, I didn't know whether to feel angry or relieved, but as I walked through the parking lot that morning, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to chase them. I wasn't going to convince them they had made a mistake, and I definitely wasn't going to rescue people who had decided I was the problem. I drove home. I put the termination folder on my kitchen table. Then I opened my laptop. There was one thing I wanted to check: my personal records. I had always kept copies of important work communications because I believed documentation protected everyone. Now I understood something else. Documentation doesn't just protect you from being blamed, sometimes it protects the truth. For the first few days, I heard nothing. I expected that. I spent my mornings looking for work, my afternoons updating my resume, and my evenings trying not to think about North Star. Then, on Friday morning, my phone rang. It was Karen from finance. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello." There was silence. Then Karen said, "Daniel, it's Karen. I know. How are you doing?" I almost smiled. "Looking for work." Another pause. "Right. What do you need?" She lowered her voice. "We're having some problems." I sat back. "What kind?" "Orders aren't matching inventory." I said nothing. She continued, "The numbers are getting worse." Still, I said nothing. Then she asked the question I had expected. "Did you leave any documentation?" I looked toward the laptop on my desk. "Yes." "Where?" "Everything is in the operations archive." "Can you send it to me?" I thought for a moment. Then I answered carefully, "Karen, I don't work there anymore." "I know. So the company should have access to its records." "We're having trouble finding them." I almost laughed. Of course they were. I told her I would check what I was legally and contractually allowed to provide. Then we ended the call. 2 hours later, Richard called. I didn't answer. He called again. Then sent a text. "Need to talk, urgent." I looked at the message. 6 weeks earlier, I had been sending him urgent warnings. Now he was sending one to me. I didn't respond. That afternoon, another message arrived. "Daniel, this situation is serious." I stared at the screen. Then I typed one sentence. "I know." I sent it. Nothing else. An hour later, Mark called. I answered this time. His voice sounded different. The confidence was gone. "Daniel, We need your help. I leaned back. My position was eliminated. I know. Then why do you need me? Because you understand the system. I smiled quietly. Apparently not. What do you mean? Your team was handling it. Silence. Then Mark said, look, things changed. No. They didn't. What? The problem didn't change. I warned you about it, he sighed. Can we meet? No. Daniel. I don't work for North Star. We can make it worth your time. That was the first moment I realized how bad things really were. They weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because the person they replaced me with couldn't fix the problem, and somewhere inside that company, the 87,000 number was growing. On Monday morning, Richard came to my house. I wasn't expecting him. When I opened the door, he was standing on my porch without his usual confident expression. Can we talk? I almost closed the door. Instead, I stepped outside. What happened? He looked exhausted. The system is worse. How much worse? He hesitated. 146,000. I felt something inside me go quiet. Not satisfaction. Not happiness. Just confirmation. You told me Mark had it under control. I was wrong. Those 3 words surprised me. Richard had never admitted being wrong to me. Not once in 11 years. What do you want? He handed me a document. We want to bring you back temporarily. I looked at it. Consulting agreement. 6 weeks. Emergency operations support. Then I looked at him. Why would I come back? Because we need you. I shook my head. You didn't need me when I warned you. He looked down. I know. You didn't need me when you fired me. I know. You didn't need me when you handed my job to Mark. I know. Then why should I help now? Richard took a breath. Because customers are starting to notice. That changed the conversation. This wasn't just about money anymore. Orders were being delayed. Customers were receiving incorrect information. The company's reputation was starting to suffer. I thought about it. Then I asked, what are the terms? Richard looked relieved. Name your rate. I gave him a number. He stared at me. That's high. It's lower than what this problem is costing you. He nodded. Okay. But I wasn't finished. I have conditions. What conditions? Full access. He nodded. No one changes my work without approval. He nodded again. Every decision gets documented. Fine. And Mark doesn't report to me. Richard looked uncomfortable. Why? Because I won't work under someone who ignored the warnings that caused this. Richard finally nodded. Agreed. I signed the agreement, but I wasn't returning as an employee. I was returning as an independent consultant. There was a difference. And they were about to learn it. My first day back was strange. People stared at me as I walked through the office. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked relieved. One employee whispered, "Thank God." I didn't respond. I went straight to the operations room. The system was a mess. Not because the software itself was bad. The configuration was. I spent 6 hours tracing the data. Then I found it. The inventory mapping had been changed 3 times. 2 of those changes had been made after my termination. That meant someone had attempted to fix the problem and made it worse. I checked the logs. There it was. Mark's team. I kept digging. Then I found something even more important. The system wasn't simply creating duplicate orders. It was using an incorrect inventory priority. That meant some customers were being promised products that had already been allocated to other customers. The problem had been hidden inside the reporting layer. And there was another issue. The company had been manually correcting numbers without fixing the underlying data. That explained why the financial loss kept growing. I printed the records. Then I called Richard. Come to the operations room. He arrived 10 minutes later. I pointed at the screen. This is your problem. He stared. What is it? Someone changed the allocation rules. When? I showed him the date. He went silent. That was after you left, correct? Who made the change? I looked at him. You already know. Richard swallowed. Mark. I nodded. Richard sat down. For the first time, I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of what the records were about to reveal. Because the more I investigated, the clearer it became. The original problem had been real, but the company's current crisis wasn't entirely my fault. Someone had made decisions after I left, and those decisions had multiplied the damage. 2 days later, the executives called an emergency meeting. Everyone was there: Richard, Karen, Mark, the CEO, and me. The CEO looked at the documents in front of him. "Daniel, explain this." I connected my laptop to the screen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I simply showed the timeline. February 3rd. System launched. February 11th. First synchronization warning. February 14th. My first email. February 22nd. Financial discrepancy reached 61,000. March 2nd. My warning about inventory mapping. March 8th. My access reduced. March 15th. I was terminated. Then I showed what happened afterward. March 17th. New mapping configuration. March 20th. Duplicate allocations increased. March 24th. Manual corrections began. April 2nd. Financial exposure reached 146,000. The room was silent. The CEO looked at Richard. "Did Daniel warn you?" Richard nodded. "Yes. Multiple times." "Yes." Then the CEO looked at Mark. "Did you change the allocation rules?" Mark shifted in his chair. "I made adjustments. Without notifying Daniel. He wasn't working here anymore." The CEO looked at me. Then back at Mark. "Why was he fired?" Nobody answered. "I didn't need to. The documents answered for me." Karen spoke quietly. "Because we were told his department was too expensive." The CEO looked at Richard. "You eliminated the person who identified the problem." Richard lowered his eyes. Then came the question that changed everything. "Who recommended it?" Mark said nothing. Richard finally answered. "I did." The CEO leaned back. The room remained silent. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Because this wasn't revenge. It was accountability. And accountability doesn't require shouting. Sometimes all you need is the truth placed in the right order. After the meeting, Mark asked to speak with me privately. I almost refused, but I agreed. He closed the office door. "You made me look bad." I stared at him. "I showed the records. You knew what would happen." "Yes. You wanted this." I shook my head. "No." "Then why did you come back?" "Because customers were being affected." He looked away. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I was under pressure." "So was I." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." He looked at me. "The company wanted savings. I gave them savings." "No," I said. "You gave them a story." He frowned. "You told them the system was fine. I thought I could fix it." "You told them I was resisting change." He said nothing. "You told them my reports were exaggerated." Still nothing. Then I asked the question I had wanted to ask for months. "Why?" He finally answered. "Because if the system failed, they would blame me." I nodded slowly. "So you made sure they blamed someone else." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That was the real betrayal. Not the firing. Not the money. Not even the humiliation. It was the decision to protect himself by pushing the consequences onto someone who had tried to prevent them. I stood up. "I'm done." He looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "I fixed the system. You can't leave." I smiled. "Watch me." I stayed for another 9 days. Not because they deserved me. Because the customers did. I rebuilt the damaged mapping. Separated the incorrect allocations. Created a clean audit trail. Then I trained 3 employees to manage the system without me. When the numbers finally stabilized, the financial exposure stopped growing. The company had lost far more than 87,000 by then, but the bleeding had stopped. The CEO called me into his office. He stood when I entered. "I owe you an apology." I didn't respond. He continued. "We handled your termination badly." "Yes. We should have listened." "Yes." He looked uncomfortable. Then he said, "I'd like to offer you your old position back." I smiled. "No." He seemed surprised. "Why?" Because I don't want my old position. What do you want? I want the consulting agreement completed as written. And after that, I'm moving on. He nodded. I understand. Before I left, he asked one more question. Daniel, if you knew this would happen, why didn't you expose everything immediately after you were fired? I thought about it. Because I didn't want revenge. He looked at me. I wanted the truth to survive. That was the answer. I hadn't needed to destroy Northstar. I hadn't needed to embarrass Richard. I hadn't needed to make Mark lose his job. Their own decisions had done enough. All I had to do was stop protecting them from the consequences. 3 months later, I received an email from Richard. The subject line said, "You were right." I opened it. He wrote that Northstar had completely changed its internal review process. No major system change could now happen without independent testing. Employees could report technical problems without going through management, and every operational warning had to be documented. Then came one final sentence. "I should have listened to you the first time." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I closed the email. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry. Because there was nothing left to say. I had moved on. I started consulting independently. Within 6 months, I had 3 clients. Within a year, I had more work than I could handle. The company that had once fired me to save money had accidentally pushed me into building something of my own. And strangely enough, that became the best part of the entire story. They thought they were cutting a cost. They were actually cutting me loose. And sometimes, being released from the wrong place is the beginning of finding the right one. Looking back, I don't think getting fired was the worst thing that happened to me. The worst thing was believing for too long that loyalty meant staying quiet. I had spent 11 years trying to protect a company. I answered calls after hours. I fixed problems nobody wanted to claim. I stayed late. I trained new employees. I warned management when something looked wrong. And I assumed that if I worked hard enough, people would eventually recognize my value. That was my mistake. Your value isn't always recognized by the people benefiting from it. Sometimes people only realize what you were doing after you're gone. But by then, it may be too late. The lesson I learned was simple. Don't confuse loyalty with allowing people to disrespect you. Don't confuse patience with silence. And never be afraid to document the truth. Because when emotions disappear, memories change. People forget what they said. They forget what they promised. They forget who warned them. But records don't forget. Emails don't forget. Dates don't forget. Numbers don't forget. And sometimes the calmest person in the room isn't the weakest. They're simply the person who knows they don't have to fight. They just have to wait. In my case, they fired me to save $87,000. Then the crisis grew. They called me back. They begged me to fix their mess. And when everything was finally exposed, I didn't take revenge. I simply handed them the truth, and walked away. Because the most powerful revenge isn't always watching someone lose. Sometimes it's watching them finally understand what they lost, while you build a better life without them. And that was exactly what I did.